Putin's special operation in Ukraine, which began in early 2022, shocked the world, but the Russian-Ukrainian conflict has been raging since 2014, following the annexation of Crimea and the start of the hybrid war on Donbass. All these years, Putin has been hatching a plan to attack Ukraine, but decided to make the final move only in 2022. In this video, we will talk about why Putin chose this particular year to carry out his special operation, and what factors contributed to it. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that you can support this channel financially through Patreon or YouTube. Other means of donating are also available. You can find all the important links in the description. Please consider supporting our channel, we'd greatly appreciate it. The first reason is the pandemic and its aftermath. Coronavirus dealt a serious blow to the world community. No country in the world was prepared for such a massive outbreak of disease among its citizens. Countries had no idea how to react, and later began to enforce lockdowns. Millions of people were forced to stay home. This caused both mass public discontent and economic problems, due to the closure of virtually all services and numerous industries. Medical expenses have increased dramatically, and some countries had to completely overhaul the entire healthcare system. The consequences of the pandemic were felt around the world. The GDP of almost all countries has shrunk or shown insignificant growth. The economies of many countries were simply frozen because of the constant lockdowns. A worldwide crisis began due to a reduction in demand for entire product segments. Resource prices were also extremely unstable. Overall, the economic backdrop was quite negative by 2022. COVID also affected politics. Lockdowns led to a drop in citizens' incomes, especially among the poorer population. Distrust toward the authorities began to grow, and compulsory vaccination campaigns provoked substantial riots across Europe and Canada. This weakening of the world's countries, particularly the West, was to the Kremlin's advantage. Putin felt that the crisis could only divide the West and shake its resolve. Indeed, there were such trends among European politicians at the beginning of the conflict. Two military events preceding the conflict became major triggers for Putin: the war in Karabakh and the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Karabakh scenario frightened Putin. He saw with his own eyes how the old, frozen conflict could suddenly turn into a hot one, and how quickly Azerbaijan was able to retake a significant part of its territory in just a month and a half. The Azerbaijani army stopped largely due to Russia's intervention, which deployed its peacekeepers and managed to keep some territories under the control of local authorities. Putin feared that a similar fate could befall Donbass or even Crimea in 10 or 20 years. That is why a solution to the Ukrainian issue would have made it impossible to reclaim these territories. The Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict took place in late 2020, just before Putin's decision to attack Ukraine. This event may have been an important trigger for the start of the special operation. The second event is the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan in 2021, which went extremely badly for the US. First of all, it turned out that the local authorities in Afghanistan were ineffective on their own. They became too reliant on the support of the US Army. Even before the withdrawal, the Afghan army began to crumble, and region after region fell to the Taliban, often without any fighting. Biden himself claimed at the time that Afghanistan had an army of 200,000 soldiers that could easily deal with the Taliban, but it turned out to be a lie. Perhaps Putin was counting on the same result when he began the special operation in Ukraine. Secondly, the evacuation of Americans took place in a hurry, and after the capture of Kabul. It was a complete failure for the American administration. This is why Western embassies began evacuating even before the special operation in Ukraine began, fearing a repeat of the situation. It's also important to note that after the failure in Afghanistan, the United States was reluctant to supply heavy weapons to Ukraine, fearing that the fiasco would repeat itself, and that American weapons would fall into the hands of the Russians, as it did with the Taliban. Putin himself saw the weakness of the American administration, and this failure was perceived as an opportunity to attack. Continuing the theme of the United States and the countries of the West, it was obvious prior to the special operation that a fairly serious political crisis was brewing there. The split in American society was already quite profound during the presidential election between Biden and Trump. Before that, internal politics suffered due to the BLM protests. American society became rather polarized. The quarantine restrictions also added to the controversy. A similar situation occurred within the European Union. Tensions were growing between Western Europe, more left-liberal, and Eastern Europe, more right-wing. In recent years, Poland and Hungary have been under pressure because of conservative laws, imposing restrictions on abortion and the LGBT community. Putin has also decided to take advantage of this divide. Putin's age was also an important factor. This year he turned 70, which is quite a lot, especially by Russian standards, where the average male life expectancy is 66 years. So Putin could no longer postpone the resolution of the Ukrainian issue for obvious reasons. Moreover, lately Putin decided to become a missionary who should leave his mark in history. Ukraine has always been a painful issue for Putin, and he feared that he would not be able to follow through. This factor is also important, and it was obvious that Putin could not wait any longer. The contemptuous attitude towards Biden and Zelensky was evident as soon as they came to power. Putin treated Biden with disdain, observing his sometimes incoherent speeches and odd decisions. The failure in Afghanistan was Biden's personal mistake. Putin thought that a weak American president like Biden would allow him to act with impunity. And his attitude to Zelensky is even worse. He does not see him as equal at all. This is due to both Zelensky's youth and his former career as a comedian. Also, Zelensky was new to politics and was not associated with the political establishment. After the start of the special operation, Putin expected Zelensky to flee. Even most Ukrainians were surprised by the decisiveness of their president. Even before the special operation, Zelensky's position was wobbly, and his ratings dropped to 20%. Zelensky's campaign against oligarchs led to a major media campaign against him. Putin saw the weakness of Biden and Zelensky as the perfect opportunity to carry out his scheme in Ukraine. China's growing influence was an important incentive for Putin personally. Russian politicians and Russian propaganda have been relying on China for years as a kind of alternative to the Western world. Much of the discussion boils down to the idea that Russia and China could become close partners and military allies. As China's power grew and the confrontation between Xi Jinping and Trump escalated, hopes for China only grew. So Putin thought that China would more explicitly support Russia in this conflict and perhaps will be able to solve its problem in Taiwan. But the reality was different. Although China sticks to neutrality and even broadcasts Russian propaganda, it still does not break ties with the West and does not get closer to Russia. It is possible that this political climate was caused by the failures of the Russian army on the front lines. But the economic ties with the West are much more valuable to China than cooperation with Russia. Basically, the Kremlin overestimated China. Russia's economic influence on Europe was also growing, and it became an important point of Russian blackmail. Thus, with the transition to green energy, many countries began to abandon the use of coal power, and at the same time switched to gas consumption as a temporary alternative on the way to a complete transition to renewable energy. The use of gas is much more environmentally friendly than coal. Some countries, such as Germany, have also begun to move away from nuclear power because of the risk associated with accidents. Thus, in recent years, many European countries have become even more dependent on Russian gas. This transition period was extremely convenient for the Kremlin, as Europe became dependent on Russia. 10 years from now, for example, that blackmail would have been almost impossible, since countries would have already replaced a significant portion of their gas consumption with renewable energy sources. In conclusion, Russia decided to launch a campaign against Ukraine now because the situation in the world following the coronavirus pandemic was unstable. Many countries were on the brink of a political and economic crisis, and Putin saw weakness in the rise of Biden and Zelensky to power. China's economic influence has grown, the Kremlin has seriously relied on it, and Russia itself has gained considerable leverage over Europe in the form of gas supplies. This video was made possible thanks to our sponsors on Patreon, Boosty, and YouTube. If you like our content, please consider supporting us.